Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whenever you're tuning into this podcast, Book Talks, a somewhat regular feature on the collegium.org website. I'm here today with Professor Cynthia Wallace. She is an associate professor of English at St. Thomas More College in the University of Saskatchewan, which is a reminder to Collegium alums that we are all over North America, not just in the United States. And Cynthia is the author of a book that just came out from Columbia University Press, The Literary Afterlives of Simone Weil, Feminism, Justice, and the Challenge of Religion. And Cynthia is kind enough to sit down with me to answer some questions about her book. And I told her that one of the things I really hope to accomplish with these book talks is to give people a real sense of the meaningfulness of the work that the author has done and to inspire lots of people to go out and get the book. You can find the link in the most recent Collegium newsletter, but also to give us a real flavor of that work, just in case we don't wind up buying the book ourselves. Cynthia, I'm going to start off by telling you, I think you pulled off a really great feat of providing enough context on Simone Weil so that people who are new to her, I'm sort of new to her, got a real sense of the vast number of tendrils in her work and connections she made intellectually with people all over the world. So enough detail to give us background, but you also inspired me to want to read more, not just to read your book, but to follow up on all the citations and so on. So congratulations on that. I'm going to start with, I hope is a really open-ended question that gets the conversation going. Why Simone Weil and why now? What is it about our current landscape that you thought made pursuing her literary afterlives an important thing to undertake?
Thanks so much, Karen, for that. It's such a great question. It's a really big question. For me, my first encounters with Simone Weil, and many people have these, it's a kind of familiarity in passing with her name or her ideas or like a quotation here and there. I was in graduate school, 15 years ago, and reading feminist theory and I was reading a lot of ethical philosophy and post-structuralism. My husband at the same time was taking theology in at Loyola University, Chicago, and he did a class on the Trinity, and they also read Simone Weil. And the big question in my mind was, how is she showing up in the radical feminist poet Adrienne Rich and in my partner's theology of the Trinity class? And it was a big mystery. So for me, the initial interest became investigating that mystery. And the more that I searched, the more I found her all over the place in so many writers, and particularly in Anglophone women writers. And what I found in that reading was this series of themes that I write about in the book. And I think these themes continue to be why Simone Weil is so important for our moment. So the first of those is she writes, I think, very cogently about the challenge of attention and the practice of attention. And we live in an era where attention is a significant challenge for us. We have attention deficits, but we also have an attention economy where our attention has been commodified and we're so distracted and there are so many inputs. And Weil writes in a way that I think is still really relevant and compelling, many decades later, about what it means to choose a discipline of attention to
Mhm.
works of art, to our education. So for those of us who are educators, this is of great interest, and also to other people in a kind of ethical practice. So that's number one. Number two, and this is really related, is the idea of moral seriousness or integrity. Again, we're living in a moment full of crises, right? We're living in a moment where climate catastrophe, and politics and polarizations and so many things kind of threaten our existence. And for those of us, again, who are educators, these are real existential concerns for our students.
Mhm.
But we also live in an age that we really prioritize comfort and safety, and sometimes even to the point of distraction. And Simone Weil gives us somebody to think through with what it might look like to live a life that maybe engages in a costly kind of integrity in those kind of engagements. Which I think is what, for example, climate scientists are saying. Those of us in the West, we maybe need to think about a more self-sacrificial way of inhabiting our energy economies, for example. So that's number two. And then number three, and I see this in so many of the writers in the book, and I see this in our world now, Simone Weil invites us to think seriously about what it can mean to both criticize religious institutions in ways that they really need critique, and also to imagine a livable spirituality or an openness to mystery and the divine in our current moment, that I think some of us are really rethinking a closure to that and thinking maybe it's time to reopen ourselves to the possibility of that spirituality having something really vibrant and living for us, but that's not in conflict with that critique that she engages in. So I see those things in so much of the literary engagement with Weil that I trace in the book, but I think those themes are also really urgently relevant in our current moment.
Absolutely. And themes like paying attention. I ran across a quote from David White not too long ago. He said, "Beauty is the harvest of attention," and it seemed like that would be something that Simone Weil would really agree with. And you point out so well that it's a discipline, and the discipline of attention, of beholding, a word that comes up several times in your own prose in this, is near and dear to the heart of Collegium alums. We're all about beholding, and increasingly, we are spending a lot of time thinking about our responsibility to a fallen world, the catastrophes that you point out. And you didn't mention artificial intelligence, but with ChatGPT version 6 on the horizon, and founders of AI tools saying, well, they're supposed to be coherent, not credible, not truthful. It seems like there is a real kind of a desperate need to take the time to revisit these ideas. You engage particularly with Mary Gordon and with Annie Dillard and Adrienne Rich. There's so many people you could have engaged with. How did you decide who was going to get room at the table?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, because there is so much work in literature on Simone Weil. I started with people who I thought had the most sustained and really intensive engagements with Weil. So for Rich, it's over many decades. And Mary Gordon has written multiple novels and a novella that really intensively kind of grapple with Simone Weil. Annie Dillard, similarly, while she doesn't cite Weil in much of her work, it's everywhere through her work, and I think really helps us understand it. And then there's also a chapter on these poets who devoted entire books or sequences to a kind of biography in poetry. But there were so many others that I could have included. So I really looked for the most intensive, and then I told myself, you can write articles in the future. You can keep going in the future.
One of the great joys of academia. We're never done. We're never done. You
No.
pull it in a sweater and it just keeps going and going and going. Thinking about yourself as a scholar, as a woman of faith, as someone who is navigating her way through a very complex world, what were some surprising insights you came to, either about um, Simone Weil's work, or insights about your own way of thinking or leaning into your vocation as a scholar and a teacher?
That's a lovely question too. I think one of the things that surprised me, the deeper that I went, the more I realized how shaped Vay's reputation is by her reception. And so there was so much more to her thought that I think is really relevant to today. So, for example, she was one of the first European thinkers to write very critically of colonialism. And that's not something that necessarily shows up in a lot of the literary writing, because that's not something that's really shown up in a lot of the scholarship or sort of the focus. But I think it made me realize how much I appreciate examples of women who have come before, who have done the hard work of trying to live a scholarly life that also has integrity in the material world. And so I really appreciated that. I was also surprised the more I read Simone Weil's writing. I was reading all of this incredible, incredible prose and poetry. Annie Dillard, like for each chapter, I reread all of the work of each writer. And these writers are just phenomenal writers. But the more I read Simone Weil herself as well, the more I appreciated her prose and her skill as a writer. And it got me thinking again about the role of beauty, which I think is something that we come back to again and again, including in Collegium conversations, and the way that beauty and justice and truth don't have to be separate and discrete, but how much they inform each other. And I don't know that I was expecting that from a scholarly project, to just keep being pulled back into this integration of so many of the pieces of my life and of the kind of interests that I hold and that I see Simone Weil holding as well.
Mhm. Well, if I don't want to sound too fangirl on you, but I thought your own prose was really elegant and accessible. Not gonna lie, when I get a book from Columbia University Press, I sort of gird my loins and I'm gonna have to have a Roget's thesaurus next to me, but that was not the case. It was a super intelligent book, but it felt like you were talking to anybody of who's willing to give big ideas a thought and who wants to engage with troubling ideas, with beautiful ideas. So it wasn't just coherent prose; it was really elegant and beautiful. So thank you for that gift, because that, I guess that's rare enough in some academic writing to be noteworthy, but I mean it very sincerely. Your own prose reflected what you just said about beauty and intentionality and integrating so many bodies of knowledge. It's a real gift.
That
Um,
means a lot to me, Karen. I just want to say thank you for that. I worked really hard to try to write a book that more people could read, because I wanted the ideas to be accessible, because I think that's consistent with the ideas in the book. So I really appreciate that.
Great. One of the things that I always hope will happen for folks at Collegium is to see how interrelated all of our disciplines are. I tell my own students every week, all of us are smarter than one of us, and there's not a single problem or there's not a single interesting idea in the world that is self-sufficient. We need everybody. So if you were writing for a bigger audience than people in English or people in theology or feminist studies, and somebody was coming to your work, this particular work, The Literary Lives of Simone Weil, with no background whatsoever. Okay, on the one hand, I've said you provide enough background to make it really coherent, but what would you really hope that someone new to these worlds you introduce us to would take away or be struck by as they read through your book?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question, because there are so many ways in, right? Like I was thinking, this book will probably interest scholars of Simone Weil who may not have any familiarity with radical feminist poetry, for example. And then people who have an interest in, say, Annie Dillard, but don't really know Simone Weil. Like you could start from a lot of places. What I would hope for anyone, even if they had no familiarity with anything, would be that they would find an interesting story about the way that ideas unfold in sometimes really surprising and unexpected streams of influence. And so I would want people to come away with a bit of more interest in all of the writers. I would hope that people would say, like, now I need to read this novel, or now I need to read this book. That's one of my hopes as a professor as well. I always, even if my students leave my classroom and the main thing is that they'll go and read another book that I didn't assign, that feels like a win. But I also hope that people would maybe have a chance to reflect on that kind of surprising chain of transmission of ideas and maybe feel a little bit inspired that even when we don't necessarily see the fruits of our own labors, there are often afterlives to everything that we do. And those afterlives have real potential to shape the imaginations and the practices of literally generations down the line. Now, we're not all geniuses like Simone Weil, but I still think, we plant these seeds and we don't always get to see who harvests and how that fruit grows. But I think this story of Simone Weil's literary afterlives over many, many decades, 70 years or so, it's a story of real fruit coming down the line. And I think that should give anybody hope, even if they didn't have an original interest in the topics at hand.
Mhm. Big fan of hope, which is way more muscular than optimism, right? It's a leaning in and digging, rolling up your sleeves and being willing to do the work to realize whatever you're hoping for. As we start to wind down a little bit, one of the senses I had when I was reading, especially the chapters on the impact on Annie Dillard and Mary Gordon, I had this vision of little teeny Simone Weils on their shoulder, whispering into their ears. And I wondered if you ever had or have that sense of Simone Weil talking to you. And of course, if you do or have, what is she saying to you, Cynthia?
Yeah, I've been thinking about my ongoing work with Simone Weil because she just accompanies me and she's not really like pat your back, you're doing so great. She's kind of more of a goad. Like she's more of a like, but she challenges, right? She doesn't let us sit down and say like that's enough, like we're good for now. Um, I think that still though, Simone Weil, she accompanies me into thinking about the non competition between commitment to material justice and engagement with sort of a mystical spiritual practice. And so that's something I'm continuing to think about with her. I'm also, as I mentioned, I'm really interested in Simone Weil as an anti-colonial thinker and the ways we can trace her legacy there and continue to learn from her. And I'm also really interested in thinking along with Simone Weil about chronic pain and chronic fatigue. So that's something that I experience. I have a stack of chronic illnesses, and Weil herself lived with very significant chronic pain and also significant chronic fatigue, which hasn't featured quite as much in the discussions of her. But I think that there's something in the way that she writes about attention and about affliction, which is her word for just radical suffering, that has real wisdom for thinking about what it looks like to live well and to live with that kind of muscular hope you were talking about, which is a kind of commitment to keep going without any assurance of outcomes, right? It's all risk, but it's risk with a vision in mind of the kind of world that we want. And it's risk with a kind of radical acceptance also of the constraints that we live within. And so I think a lot with Simone Weil about those challenges.
Hmm. That kind of is a perfect segue to my last question. You've talked about continuing to think about thus and so, either Simone Weil or big ideas. What's next up for you? What's your next big project?
Yeah, so I'm working on some book chapters right now, Karen. I have a book chapter that is about these kind of ideas of hope along with Simone Weil. And I have a book chapter on Simone Weil in the body that I'm contributing to a Routledge companion to Simone Weil that's coming out. I'm also working on a book chapter on a theology of disability and chronic illness and shared breath that also draws on Simone Weil's idea of obligations and responsibilities as a grounding for our care for each other. But my next big book project is it kind of pulls a lot of that together. And it is a creative critical mashup. So it's a memoir that's really threaded through with these kind of theoretical interlocutors about an idea that I'm calling agonistic communion. So agonistic, like in the Greek sense of a protracted struggle, but not antagonism where we fight each other in polarization, but where we enter into a good faith struggle. And then communion in all of its senses, from the most common to the most religious and spiritual. And the question at the center of that book is, what does it look like to live with integrity and hope and commitment in the face of struggles that may not see a resolution in our lifetimes, whether that be chronic illness or whether that be climate catastrophe and raising children in climate catastrophe, which I'm doing, whether that be educating my students or loving family who have very, very radically different political views, or what it looks like to still be invested in institutions like higher education and the church that don't always live up to our hopes for them. What does it look like to engage in that with honesty about struggle that also seeks to really enter into communion together? And so I'm hoping that that book can pull together a lot of the pieces of that I'm learning from Simone Weil, as well as everything else. She goes with me on my shoulder into this project as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of my favorite phrases that showed up, I can't remember which chapter, but she talks about unselfing and radical decentering, and just kind of really on our cases to get away from our usual solipsism. And it sounds like that's really had an impact on some of your thinking. So we will stay tuned and probably be following up with another book talk before too long. As as we bring this one to a conclusion, I just want to remind folks that we've been talking with author Cynthia Wallace about her brand new book from Columbia University Press, The Literary Afterlives of Simone Weil, Feminism, Justice, and the Challenge of Religion. The great essayist Brian Doyle, who is one of my colleagues here at the University of Portland, had a wonderful idea that summertime, which is when Cynthia and I are having this conversation, summertime is not a time for beach books, or if we're going to cling to our idea of beach books, he said, then those should be the big, thick books that you never have time for in the rest of the year. And that's what you should bring to the beach. And one of the great gifts Cynthia has given us, in addition to her book, is pointing us to the works of Annie Dillard and poets like Adrienne Rich and novelists like Mary Gordon. We're at the very beginning of summer. It's time to fill your bags with those books and enjoy the ride. Enjoy beholding, enjoy being a person of hope, someone who sits with beauty, who has the discipline to think through ideas that really matter, and to use Cynthia's own words, to do that with integrity and wholeness. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you, Cynthia, for your time with us, and we look forward to reading your next big project.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Bye for now.